21, we're still within the short long way section. That's 18 to 25, which also is the rest of Tanya, not just here. 18 and 19 talks about the hidden love that crops up in a time of spiritual crisis. That's one of the assertions that we make from it. So we want to do is we want to pull that out and apply it when it's not a spiritual crisis. That's part of what the goal is right now. So part of how we're going to do that is showing us how does God exist in the world? What does a sin actually do? Not just, if I give in to this, that, whatever, then I could transgress. But what does a transgression actually do? What does it cause? We have all these chapters now that it's going to show it to us. They'll say, wait a second. I always thought because I would never denounce my Judaism, I would never denounce my connection with God, I would never denounce God. When I do these other things, it's not denouncing God. Or it's not creating the separation. There's no rift. Well, that's part of the Chassidus that comes over us to say, it's not so bad. That's the whole thing. It's like, no, this is not a separation. That's how it gets us to be like, if it's not a separation, I can do this. That's where this all comes in. So that's part of why now we have to show what is this whole thing of God within the universe? What does all this mean of God having created the world and existing? Especially to say that God created the world. So that means if there's God and creation, there are two things. If I build a table, there's me and there's the table that I built. If you write a book, there's me and then there's book. That means anyone can take the book and it's not connected to me anymore. I might have put a lot of me into it, but it exists separate from me. God created the world, so there's God and then there's the world. That's the mistake that all the philosophers made about the clock, the watchmaker theory. God is like the watchmaker. He made the watch, then he walked away from it, and the watch could just keep ticking on its own. Categorically deny that. Very specifically because God created the world as a something from nothing. So that means God has continually sustained it. Throw a ball in the air, it's going to stay in there as long as that propulsion is there. As long as that force pushing it into the air is there. As soon as that force goes, then gravity kicks in and then it comes back down again. The natural state of the world is to not exist. That is why God has to keep it in existence. And he does that through speech. Very important. When the humans speak, the words leave us, they separate from us, and they're not ours anymore. There's always like the Lashon Hara story that they tell. The woman who couldn't control her mouth. Right? So she goes to the rabbi, what am I supposed to do? So take a pillow and cut it open and spread all the feathers into the wind. Okay. She spreads all the feathers into the wind. And she goes back, okay, now go and collect all the feathers. What? So that's the same thing as your words that wants to leave your mouth and they're out there. That's the way human speech works. When we talk about God created the world, obviously if God spoke, these words left him to create the world. We say, no. We're using speech because we understand what speech is, but we don't necessarily understand God's speech. Because God's speech does not detach from him. If it would, that means that now something exists that's not him. That's a punchline of everything. As soon as you say, but it whatever, then you're creating an existence that isn't him, which denies and defies Achdus Hashem, the unity of God within creation. When it comes to human speech, it reveals what was previously hidden in the speaker's thoughts. I have a lot of things going on in my head, but until I actually say them, you don't know what's going on in my head. And then sometimes when I say them, you still don't know what's going on in my head. That's what speech does. It tells you what I'm thinking. You can't see my thought, but speech tells you. The other thing about human speech is that it separates from the source. As soon as the words leave my mouth, they're not mine anymore. Anyone can take them and do whatever they want with them, but I can't put them back into my mouth. Divine speech works a little bit differently because it reveals what was previously hidden in the sense that God's chachma, that God decided, okay, I'm going to create a world. God spoke and brought the world into being, but that speech did not separate from him. So they're true of the one characteristic, but not of the second characteristic. It's hard for us to understand it, but that's why we have here, my thoughts are not like your thoughts, so my ways are higher than your ways. We're trying to understand, no, but when we speak, this is what happens. So of course, when God speaks, this is what happens. It's like, no. Don't forget that we're not on the same plane as God. It's not the same. It's similar, but it's not the same. So we have to remember that as we're learning about this. The punchline is, though, that God's speech does not separate from him. It still exists within him. It goes for everything. The world was created. The 10 statements, speeches that created the world. These were revelations of the divine light and the life force. And also, by the way, all the words of Tanakh, when we talk about words of prophecy and stuff like that, it's still all within the godness of God's speech. This does not separate from him. This all still exists within him, which goes back to what we said last time, that God created the whole world and he didn't change. All that occurred is that something that was hidden was now brought to light. We had the divine light that was just everywhere, and then God channeled it to create a world. He created the world through speech, but the speech of God does not separate from him. There's only one difference that occurs. And to whom does that difference occur? For us, it's different. For God, it's not. It's all the same thing. God created a world, didn't create a world. He spoke, he didn't speak. It doesn't make a difference to him. As far as he's not changed by it, it doesn't fundamentally change God. We are changed by it. Why? Because it actually brought us into existence. For Hashem, nothing whatsoever has changed in revealing his creative power and bringing about creation. God was like, I'll have a world. Okay, he created a world. He's still the same God. Nothing changed about him. You're like, but he has a world now. Like, yeah, but so what? Remember, that's what we already did all the calculations last time of saying, of course it's a big deal. He created a world. Yeah, maybe if you weren't God, it would be a big deal. But when you're God, and that's just such a tiny little part of everything, you're making a big deal about one drop in an entire ocean. It's not even a logical comparison to be making. However, for created beings, us and the whole world that we occupy, Creation brought about through God's word represents the greatest possible change ever. What is that? Existence. Since they come into being only when the divine word begins to actually create worlds. We think it's a big deal because we don't exist without it. That's just for us. For God, it's no big deal to have created a world. Question. God's speech does not separate from him. Yes. Unity of God within creation is that nothing actually separates from him. You could apologize for what you said, but you can't actually put the words, you can't undo what's been said. Because we're using the word of speech with God, we're not trying to redefine what nature is. We're just trying to say that we're making this comparison, we're making a parallel, but it's not a perfect parallel. Because everything is still within the Godness. How could something separate from God? When we speak, it separates from us because that's the way human speech works. It seems that we're all separate entities. We talk and then the words go. And so we're like, oh, but God spoke, so he talks and the words go. And it's like, no. Same, but different. Yes, God spoke and the world came into being. That's because speech reveals what's been hidden. But it doesn't actually separate from him. Because nothing can separate from him. The recurring theme of all this, what does it mean that God is a uniting force within creation? Hashem Echad, that's a whole separate thing. If you listen to, there's a mimer about that. Echad, why does it say Hashem Echad and not Hashem Yachid? God is singular. When you say Echad, you're saying one. One means that there's a 2, a 3, and 4. You're going to use the word one if there's not other numbers that come after it. You're saying, no, this is alone. This is unique. So how come it doesn't say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Yachid? It says that Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Different explanations for it. And if you listen to Kol Mach B'Echad, which can be found on the YouTube channel. One thing that Kol Mach B'Echad talks about, the point of using the word Echad, is that even though the world seems to now contain a plurality because there's so many different existences, it's still one. It is still all him. That's something that Echad allows for that Yachid doesn't. So that's why Echad is this very specific word that's been chosen. You say, oh, God is singular, unique, and we're like, yeah, but we're all here. So Echad is saying that, yeah, you're all here, but you're still all within the oneness of God. You just keep bringing the point home to saying that you can't run and you can't hide. So when you think, oh, I'm just going to do this one little thing, and it's not going to be such a big deal, it's like anything you do that's not to him is even unintentionally rebellion against him. That's what we're going to be getting to in describing all these things. But that's why it's important also to describe about God within creation. God is everything. But God spoke and the world came into being. When we speak, the words aren't ours anymore. We create things and we can walk away from them. True, but that's not the way it works when God creates the world. Because again, then you're allowing for an existence that isn't him. And we're specifically underlining here that that is not possible. The world cannot exist like that. Not least because, first of all, it's not how God's speech works. And also because, again, you need this outside force to act upon it. The natural state of the world is not to exist. It's to not exist. That's why God has to continually keep it in creation. He continually speaks. As we said last time, the words always stand firm in the heavens because God has to keep speaking to keep us here. But for God, God always existed. So he's like, oh, look, I'm going to reveal my power of creation. Theoretically, God says that. Look, I'm going to reveal my power of creation. You can't make an exact comparison because you're talking about a finite being to God. It doesn't work. Now, there are ways that God brought us into existence. Some of it we're going to go into further and some of it not. Something called the Ila and Alul, cause and effect, which first of all is not how the world came into being with something from nothing because it doesn't make sense to all of a sudden get a physical being from virtual nothingness. Ila and Alul, that's cause and effect, which there's a lot of Chassidus actually on it also, which the whole thing about the relationship between cause and effect is that somewhere within the cause, you could find the seed of the effect. As in, oh, I could see how potentially this could come about. You still have to go through the process for it to come about, but when you look at the origin point, you're like, oh yeah, I can see kind of what this might lead to. That's part of the existence of the world is cause and effect, but that's not how actually the world came about. Brings it in here because it talks about how there's a lot of different things that had to occur, but the actual moment of creation. So contraction versus a veiling of the light. Contraction is taking the massive light and, well, contracting it, like a laser point. The laser, what they did is they took a very extremely powerful light and they contracted it into a narrow beam. So that's, Tzimtzumim kind of did that. The divine light. Well, first, God had to create a void wherein existence could come about. So the existence comes about through this extremely contracted light. And through that, existence comes about. Okay, we're going to get more into Tzimtzumim, so I'm not going to sit on it too much here, but that's basically what Tzimtzumim is. For God, even though there's this whole cause and effect stuff that occurs and all the Tzimtzumim that occurs, nothing's hidden from him. I think a keyhole is kind of a good example. For us, we're looking on the other side of the keyhole, so we can only see a small part of it. God's on the other side of the keyhole. He sees the entire image, right? He sees everything. There's nothing that like, oh, but there's a keyhole that like contracts the image. It's like, no, not for him, it doesn't. Which gets us into here. If God is everything that's in the world, and we say, oh, everything is God, and God, nothing separates from him, etc. But even with all creation, we have Echad, it's not Yachid. Well, why are we not aware of him? Why do we not see him within creation? If God is the entire world and nothing exists apart from him, why do we not see him? One of the ultimate questions. Especially, it gets reinforced after all we've said. That the world is not separate from God, so where is he? Why do I not see him? Well, the ultimate answer is because to preserve the illusion of independent existence. The side effect of creation, of God saying I can create a world with this reward and punishment and free choice, is that God had to hide himself from creation. Even though from God's perspective, Gam choshech lo yachshech mimeka, even the darkness does not obscure anything from you. As in, God sees everything, right? That's literally what it means. God can see everything because darkness doesn't hide anything from him. But another explanation is that even the darkness does not obscure because it derives from you. The darkness that we see as in spiritual darkness, it can't hide God because it is from God. It is actually from him. Spiritual darkness for us. There's no spiritual darkness from God. The darkness is from him. Building on that, only a foreign body can be an obstruction. One cannot hide from his own self. They say a turtle or a snail. The example that's given is like a turtle. If we're standing there, we're looking at a turtle, and all of a sudden the turtle gets scared and it pulls into its shell. We're like, oh no, where'd the turtle go? What do you mean where'd the turtle go? It's right there. The turtle's not inside of its shell going, where'd it go? Where am I right now? Existential crisis because all of a sudden it pulled into the shell. The turtle is like, I'm still here. That's us. We're looking at the turtle shell and we're like, where's the turtle? What do you mean where's the turtle? The turtle is right here. This shell, quote unquote, that we see is part of the turtle. The turtle cannot hide from itself. God has, quote unquote, he created a shell around himself, but the shell is himself. We see it and we're like, where'd he go? I'm still here. There's a shell over me right now. So the entire world, the entire existence, everything, all of creation, we're like, no, it must be separate. It's not separate. God is just hidden from us, which is part of the preserving illusion of the independent existence. Because if not, we'd just be subsumed in the godness. If not, there would be no free choice, there'd be no anything. It would just be, of course we're divine beings. Of course we fall in the way of God. We want to see the turtle's face. We want to see the turtle's hands. We want to see that part of the turtle, not just its shell. But if we would see that, there'd be no free choice. It would not be the world that God wanted to exist. So a side effect of allowing for these things to occur is that God hid himself, which actually goes back. Remember we spoke about the world as Helem, hidden because Elokim and Avaya. It's a side effect of creation that God had to be hidden from us. And because God is hidden from us, that allows now for the spiritual darkness to come in, for the challenges and the hardships to come in. There are no shadows when there's nothing to block the sun. The sun is always shining indiscriminately. What creates a shadow is a blockage. Something is there, and that's why there's a shadow. Not because the sun went anywhere, but because something blocked it. In creation, that would be kind of the shell kind of mitigates. So we can't see the face of the turtle. So this is all going to be the lead up because next chapters we're going to start getting into, well, so then why do people actually transgress? What does sin actually happen? Because we look at the turtle shell and we say, where's God? But we have to know where you're seeing the turtle shell, it's part of the turtle. Just because it doesn't look like it, but it's still part of it. Ki Havaya hu Elokim. Havaya is Elokim. Not just Lord is your God, etc. But Havaya is Elokim. Elokim is the aspect of God, the name for God that we use for creation. It's the name of nature. They would say Bereshis bara Elokim. That name of God, because it's referring to that aspect of creation. Nature are the patterns that we recognize within the world. It's the rules that God created for the universe. But it's also, because it's nature, it is the force that conceals Havaya. Havaya is the actual power of creation. Elokim is the way it was brought about. But Havaya is actually, it's the truth. It is actual creation. If you've ever learned the Amarim of Hechaltzu, it gets very much into this. That Elokim allows for multiplicity, and Havaya is actually one. But because Havaya brings about Elokim, that means there's the potential for all that's within Havaya. But the point of saying Ki Havaya Elokim is because we say, oh look, it's nature. Oh look, it's the concealing forces. It's like, no. That nature, that concealing force, it's still all Havaya. It is still God, basically. We're recognizing now that when we look at the world and we say, oh, but there's all these separately existing beings. There's so much about creation. All this is turtle shell. And the turtle shell is part of the turtle. Yes. Remember, there's different stages of when Mashiach. The rules of the world are going to be different when Mashiach comes. We're not going to be making choices anymore. The moral choices that we make today, the light and darkness choices, they're not going to be choices when Mashiach. We can't compare the way that we know the world now to the way the world is going to be then. It's going to be a totally different reality. The whole world is going to know God the way the water covers the seas, etc. When we talk about, when Mashiach is going to come, there's not going to be any war anymore, there's not going to be any sickness anymore, there's not going to be any death anymore, etc. Right? Well, where does all this stuff come from? God is good, and everything God does, God's always in the world, so how can there be spiritual darkness? How can there be death? How can there be any of this sort of stuff? Well, all that occurs when there's an obscuring of godliness. That's all the stuff that blocks the godliness that creates the shadows of the spiritual darkness, and the challenges and all that sort of stuff. So when Mashiach comes, there's going to be nothing to block the light anymore. The mindset is going to be so different. When there's no shadows, then there's nothing blocking the sun. There's going to be no more wars anymore because no one's going to be fighting anymore. Why is no one going to be fighting anymore? Well, why do people fight to begin with? Arrogance, anger, any of these kinds of stuff. That's what ultimately leads to war, is it not? So Mashiach's going to come. If we're all going to be united before God, there's going to be no more arrogance, there's going to be no more anger, there's going to be no more any of that kind of stuff. Which means that no one has any reason to fight somebody else. Where does hatred come from? These are negative traits. Negative darkness is the obscuring of light. So if nothing could block light anymore, that means there will be no more wars because these negative traits will have no place to exist anymore. A shadow does not exist in the light. It cannot, by definition. definition, it cannot. Because a shadow could only exist where the light's blocked. So if you take away all the blockages, then it's only light. And that's Messianic times. That's kind of a sidetrack, but if it makes sense to you. That's the whole chapter 21. It's not a very long chapter, but the points that it makes are the very important points. Nature is the channel that God used for creation. We can't handle Havaya in its pure form. So instead, God had to create a way for Havaya to bring about creation. Havaya is where creation comes from. That's where the power of creation comes from. Quote unquote. But God couldn't just put it there. He needed a conduit for it. Some way to allow this to come into being. So what God did was he created the shell, which we would call Elohim. So now I could package it for you so you can handle it now. When they have a pill, they don't just shoot the stuff into you. They compact it into a medication that has a casing around it. We look at nature. Elohim is Teva, which is nature. Like, what do you mean that God is? Look, there's nature. Look, there's existence. Yeah, but Elohim is Havaya. Havaya is Elohim. As a human being, you see them as being separate. It's the same thing. Elohim is still part of the godness. It's part of Havaya. It's a way of creation coming about. It's pointing to the turtle shell and saying, look, there's no turtle there. There's only a shell. Yeah, there's a turtle there. It's inside the shell. And the shell is its own self. Think about it with the whole thing with a yarmulke. Like, you can't conceal your own self kind of thing. The other guys, and you have the structure to get the sleeve over their head because you're not supposed to put your own hand because that's not really covering them. So if you create a covering, you're not really hidden. When you play peekaboo with a baby, where did you go? Your hands hid you? Your hands are you. You're like, hey, where'd I go? The baby, when they can't see you, they think you disappeared, but you didn't go anywhere. You just got blocked. You're right there. You're blocking yourself with your own hands. So it's your own self that's blocking. You imagine every time you cover your eyes and you're like, hey, where am I? Oh, here I am. That's what the baby sees. That's not what you see. You're like, I'm still here. All I do is cover my face. That's God within creation. Metaphorically, all he did was cover his face. And then we're like, where'd he go? Right here. I'm right behind the quote-unquote hands. And the hands are still part of me. We're like, no, I don't see you. You must not be here. There's a 1980s comedy movie called Oh God. Have I told you about this? It has some interesting points. It's not a perfect film. Okay, it's also not a perfect film. It's out in the 1980s, so deal with the spoiler alert right now. Me and George Burns plays God in it. So it's basically some like random supermarket guy, and God appears to him. So they go through the way we would go through of, well, if you're God, prove it. So he goes, well, what do you want me to do? And he always lie, like, you want me to do a magic trick? Like, you want me to do, so we'll take out a pack of cards. How do you want me to prove that I'm God? Well, that's a good question. If God appears to you, what can he do that would make you believe that this is God? The film's a little bit weird, but it does bring out some interesting points. So at the end, he ends up in this court case. I don't remember all the details of the film. So at one point, George Burns God walks in, and they put him on the witness stand. So he goes through the whole thing again. Well, if you're God, prove it. What do you want me to do? You want me to do tricks? So he takes out the cards again. It's also because it's in the 80s, so the graphics are terrible. The jump cuts feel exactly like, look, he disappeared. You see the jump cut. The point is, so God comes and he proves whatever, and everybody in the court is like, oh, look, okay, he actually is God. And then all of a sudden, God disappears. And they're like, okay, we're going to go deliberate now if the guy who was on trial, if he's innocent or not. Soon they call him into the back room, and they're like, look, you have to hear what happened. So they go back to play the tape again, and all that part where God was officially in the courtroom is now static. The sound is static. And they're like, we don't know what to tell you because he's not on the tape. You literally just saw him, and they're like, yeah, but we don't really know if he was here. You actually just saw him, but now all of a sudden they're questioning because they're static on the tape. Whatever the film ends with, whatever. But that moment is such a good punchline of, we're like, where is he? Where is he? You're looking at him. And we're like, no, we're not. No, we're not. Even think about if you have a big miracle in your life. You just saw Havaya between Elohim. How long do you actually fully remember that for? Before we forget. And we're like, no, it goes back to the static on the tape. After you just saw him. But what happened to the Jewish people coming out of Mitzrayim and all that sort of stuff? The miracles they saw, and still somehow they ended up in a golden calf. And still they ended up with the spies in the desert. Not to take away from them, it's just because we're humans. Even with all that, we still end up making mistakes. Or we could sometimes get dissuaded. This is the lead up to everything. What the next chapter is going to start with, after we've asserted all this, and we say there's nothing but God in the world, the reason we don't see him is because he hid himself from us, but everything's the turtle shell. And we have a part of us that will do anything to protect the connection that we have to God, to the point of Mesiras Nefesh, even though it makes no sense to give up your life for God, but in the sense of, well, if you give up your life, you're not living anymore, and you're supposed to do Torah. Even to the point of Mesiras Nefesh, we protect our connection to God, but we know that ultimately we sin, we transgress. With everything that we know right now, how can any of this come about? Which is part of why, if we learn all this, and we keep the awareness of this, we hope that it will keep us on the right path. You don't have to wait for a moment of Mesiras Nefesh, as long as you remember that we're always looking at the turtle shell. And the turtle shell is the turtle. We're trying to bring this all to the fore to be a reminder for us and to be something that we want to integrate into our realities that we live day to day. And through that should keep us on the right track. And that should be prompting us and helping us to make the right decision. Because the long short way requires hours and hours of meditation and concentration. But it gets us to that point where the love of God that we create and the fear of God is so deeply ingrained within us, we always make the right decision after that. We have to take a longer route to get there. Because this constant reminder, it's not necessarily fully ingrained within us, which is why we need this. We get stuck in, wait, did we see him? The tape got static. So we're trying to combat that right now. In lots of metaphors and in short.